I am responding to a claim made by Joseph Lee that nuclear power plants are the key to sustainable energy. Based on the reasoning that nuclear power generates more energy than its alternatives, it has a smaller environmental impact than coal-powered energy, and is more efficient in terms of lands and resources. However, my claim to you is that nuclear energy is not the best option for sustainable energy, based on the idea that coal is a much more abundant resource than uranium, the most popular nuclear fuel. Uranium has its own level of environmental impact beyond coal, and the efficiency of nuclear energy is not as relevant outside specific circumstances given by my opponent. So to go with my first point, coal is a much more abundant resource than is uranium. Based on my opponent's source, given from the European Nuclear Society, who has their own interest to discredit coal energy, that uranium per kilogram was much more efficient in generating energy than was coal. However, what that statistic fails to mention is that there are 5.7 million tons of uranium left in the world, according to worldnuclear.org. And according to the Energy Information Administration, there are 1.2 trillion tons of coal left in the world. It's 5.7 million tons versus 1.2 trillion tons. So coal is a much more accessible resource than uranium. It's much easier for us to get and use to generate our power. In the second point, my opponent pointed out that coal does emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when we use it to generate power. Mining of coal strips away topsoil and trees and has its environmental impact, which is true and needs to be taken into consideration. But uranium mining also has its own environmental toll. As I mentioned, it's harder to get to. More mining has to be done. According to this report by Stanford, uranium mining will strip away soil like coal mining and leave the resulting land with, quote, radioactive toxic elements and increased erosion, landslides, and pollution of soil and water, end quote. It also, while it does produce less emissions, will dump on average 200 million tons of waste and 4.3 million tons of hazardous waste, according to worldnuclear.org, some of which is plutonium with a half-life of 24,000 years. Every 24,000 years, half of it is gone. That entire time, it's in the ground. It's wherever we put it, staying radioactive, staying hazardous to people. Go with my third point. My opponent presented the example of Japan with a small area in terms of country. They don't have a lot of land to work with to generate solar power or wind power, or a lot of access to coal to fuel coal power, or a lot of space to put these big plants. My reasoning is that nuclear efficiency is not as relevant outside areas that are not Japan. Japan, like I mentioned, it's an island, doesn't have a lot of surface area. In fact, it has 145,000 square miles compared to the US, which has 3.8 million square miles. China 3.7 million, Russia 6.6 million, etc. These areas also have very steady access to coal and land for wind and solar generation. And I would point out that Japan's nuclear power program recently failed in the Fukushima disaster in 2002, killing 19,000 people, forcing 160,000 people to evacuate, destroying over 1 million buildings, and leaking radioactive material into the ocean for years to come. To sum up, though nuclear power does have its place in applications with limited access to resource or space, for instance, I know the Navy uses it to power submarines and ships. It does have its place in application. However, for the general public, nuclear power is not the best option we are currently looking at for sustainable energy, based on that, for one, coal is a more abundant resource than uranium. 2, uranium has its own environmental impact beyond coal. And 3, the efficiency of nuclear energy is not as relevant outside specific circumstance.
All right, well, you previewed the advocate's claims pretty clearly, and then you basically preview your own arguments. It sounds like there are going to be a whole series of counterclaims on the individual points. There is an occasional reference to information that the advocate presented, but usually the response is a rebuttal argument as opposed to any analysis of the advocate's own evidence and reasoning. The rebuttals are pretty good for the most part, although the first one, I think, is a little bit problematic because the amount of uranium that you need to produce energy versus the amount of coal that's required to produce energy is never explained. So this disproportionate amount of the resource may not be as critical as it's being portrayed here because you use the resources in different ways. And I think that may be a little bit misleading. And so you want to be careful about that. The second point I thought was labeled clearly. You get to that. You've got a good piece of information that talks about what the potential dangers of uranium mining are. I do think we run into a little bit of the same issue here. We don't know how much land is going to be affected, but the notion that there's going to be long-term possibilities, and you do quantify some degree of pollution that is already taking place. You mentioned plutonium and what the potential risks are there. I do think that you could probably build that risk up a little bit more. Again, there's not really a lot of discussion of what the advocate's arguments are on this point. It's mostly counterclaim material. And on the third point, the Japan example, when you talk about Fukushima, you might want to be careful. The 19,000 dead didn't necessarily die from a nuclear power accident. They died for the same reason that there was a nuclear power accident, the tsunami that flooded the country. I think equating the two is a little bit problematic and probably disingenuous, so you want to be careful about that. All right, thank you.